So we'll begin this Q&A with this first question. And again, I picked this question, I think, because it's very relevant to our day and age, particularly to the riots and this aftermath after the appalling murder of George Floyd. So the question is as follows. Dear Rabbi, can you please share your comments on the George Floyd murder and the riots and the looting that this ensued? I am besides myself, as so many others, and I'm looking for guidance. Thank you very much. Okay. So I'm actually in the midst of writing a piece that hopefully will be ready either later tonight or tomorrow. But obviously, the George Floyd murder and the riots that ensued, as mentioned right here in the question, are just the symptom of a much deeper problem. And I think that in order to solve this deeper problem, we really have to go to the root of it all. And what's at the root? I think at the root, there are many things that we, each and every one of us, and society in general can do in order to ensure that not only do appalling murders like the George Floyd murder do not happen again, but also so that our society recreates this harmony, this unity that once upon a time existed. What am I speaking about? I think I'm speaking about three major changes that I believe, and feel free to disagree with me, but that I believe need to happen as much as possible, as quickly as possible, by each and every one of us. Change number one speaks of the change of vision. And I'm gonna write about this soon, but the change of vision, what I refer to is being able to see the good in everyone, to see the divinity in everyone. Too often we encounter people and all we can focus on is their negative side, is the darkness within the light, so to speak. You know, it's one of the things that shock me the most when I go to funerals. I'm astounded each time anew that all the eulogies that are recited are positive ones. And you ask yourself, where are all the crooked people? Where are all the people that we hate? What, they don't die? You don't hear of them dying. I mean, you certainly don't hear of them at the funerals, because everyone at a funeral, all the deceased at funerals are saints, according to the eulogy. So what happened? Do people change when they die and that's why? No. The answer is that we change when people die. Our perspective on people changes. We learn then to see the big picture, to see the goodness, even in the person that we may have fought with. But when that person dies, all of a sudden the eyes open up to a new facet that maybe we were too lazy to see before, or maybe we were too blind and numb to see before. And in a way, I think that's change number one that needs to happen. Too often, and I see this as a rabbi so often, unfortunately, but too often we get into fights and we focus on the little trivialities of life instead of really looking at the goodness in everything and in every person, because there is a soul. There is a divine soul in every person. There's infinite potential in everyone. There are good parts to every single person we like or dislike. So why not focus on those and see the divine image? B'tselem Elohim bara otam. God said that he created Adam and Eve and every human being with a divine image. Why not focus on that divine image in our human relationships? So there needs to be a change of vision. That's number one. I'm trying to condense this as much as possible because we have quite a few questions tonight. Change number two, I think, is the change of discourse. I think the discourse in our country is a discourse of division. And I'm not just speaking about discourse of clear division. This discourse that even a 4-year-old knows, that person is hating, that person is dividing. But I'm even speaking about discourse that includes the words such as diversity, such as we and them. I'm reminded, and it was spread over the internet massively during these past few days, but I'm reminded of the story of the Lubavitcher Rebbe when David Dinkins, I think was his name, the mayor of New York City, in 1991, came to the Rebbe for a blessing. And this was during or maybe shortly after the riots of Crown Heights, the infamous riots of Crown Heights, in which a Hasidic Jew was murdered following a car accident that hit a young black child. And David Dinkins came to ask for a blessing from the Lubavitcher Rebbe for both sides, so that there should be peace on both sides. In other words, the Jewish side and the African-American side. And the Rebbe said that's where the problem, something like this, I'm not quoting verbatim, but that's where the problem begins. when we see two sides. We're all on one side. We're all on the same side. We're all, as it says in the Constitution, one nation under God, under one God. That's who we are. Speaking about diversity doesn't help much, even if we speak about respecting diversity, because it means that there's them and there's us. I think the discourse therefore needs to change, and we need to start replacing the they with we, replacing the them with us. That's how we ought to be speaking. We're in the same boat, all of us. We all have the same divine image. I do believe that we all have good sides in us. Let's focus on that. Let those good sides make us that united we, that united us. Instead of speaking of the differences between us, let's speak about that which unites us, that which points to this fact that the Lubavitcher Rebbe so brilliantly pointed out, that it's not two sides, but rather one side of humanity and one side only. That's number two, a change of discourse. So we said a change of vision, change of discourse. And I also think that there needs to be a change of behavior. And what I mean by that is that too often I think our behavior is quite selfish. We live, after all, in what many call the selfie generation, where the only focus is what's in it for me, what's good for me. And our actions reflect that. You know, the looting certainly is part of that disgusting, selfish perspective on life, where I only live for myself and that's it, not for the other and nothing else. You know, we spoke about this, but in Israel, there are two seas. I think we spoke about this last week or a few weeks ago, two seas. There's the Dead Sea, and there's a very sea that's very alive, the Kinneret, the Galilee Sea. Now, why is one sea, called alive and one dead? Literally, it's called the Dead Sea because the Dead Sea only takes. It doesn't give. So it's dead. It's spiritually dead. The Galilee Sea takes and gives. So it's very much alive. If you only take, if it's only about you and your actions reflect that, you don't put time aside each and every day, as we should, to think about someone else, even just one person, to think about actually doing something for someone else, then we'll perpetuate this selfie generation, the selfie mentality. And I think, therefore, there also needs to be a change in behavior, in actual behavior, where we start thinking about the other and doing something for the other much more than for ourselves. The righteous, by the way, in the Zohar, in the foremost book of Kabbalah, are defined as people who have no sense of self. What does that mean? They don't know who they are. Of course they know who they are. But what it means is that they don't live for themselves at all. The Lubavitcher Rebbe never thought about himself. The Rabbi Steinsaltz never thinks about himself. He's there to serve 24/7. Fine, so that's the righteous. But can we at least dedicate 1 hour a day where we are serving? I think if we see this change of action, then society will begin to change. And yes, we can speak about what they are doing, what these organizations are saying, and we can speak about the outside. It's very convenient. But as Gandhi famously said, you have to be the change that you want to see in the world. It starts with us. It starts with repairing relationships that we have that are broken in our own network. It starts with actions that we have to dedicate each and every day, again, to serve others. It starts with speaking with us, speaking about the we and not the them. That's where it starts. I think if we can incorporate these three fundamental changes in our society will look very different. Because I do believe that that's what the root issue is. Again, the George Floyd and the riots and so on are only symptoms. We really have to go to the root. And the root is that vision that is so lacking, that divine vision, that discourse that is so lacking, the discourse of we and not of us and them, and the behavior, the actions that are so lacking, the actions in which we dedicate, yes, a full hour, not asking you to be righteous, 24 hours. That's what they do. But 1 hour a day in which I dedicate completely to the other. And I'm sure that if we can each do that and try to influence our surroundings with those three changes, then things will certainly change. So that's my short comments on George Floyd and the riots that we are all experiencing. I received a similar question, which I'll quote, and I'll give an answer that touches upon what we just said. and that is regarding everything that's been happening within the last week. I want to do something to help, but I don't know what that something is. There's an element of anti-Semitism within the Black Lives Matter movement, as anti-Semitic graffiti and destruction of synagogues, etc. News reporter all over the board with varying opinions and different facts and figures. Whom should we believe? I'd like to donate money to help fight racial injustice, but how do we know where the money is actually going? Being indifferent and doing nothing is the worst. But yet, I'm stuck as I don't know what to do. It's an excellent question. It's true, because there's so many organizations that seem to be representing very noble causes, but when you dig into them, you see that there's a lot of flaws and terrible things within those organizations too. So what do you do? Number one, be the change that you want to see in the world, as we just said, with those 3 suggested fundamental changes. Number two, I think that we can't make a difference, I think, instantly at least, on the entire world, on an entire society. But we can begin with our neighbor. We can begin with the people living down the street from us, maybe even with our neighborhood. That if you live in an HOA, those are smaller neighborhoods usually, then you can begin over there. How do you do that? Well, if you have someone that is suffering from racial injustice, reach out to that neighbor. I'm reminded of that tremendous story of so many stories. I mean, I can think of so many, but I don't know if you know, but Louis Armstrong, you know, the saxophonist, the jazz saxophonist, he spoke Yiddish fluently. Why? Because when he grew up in New Orleans, he found himself in the streets at a very young age. Who adopted him? A Russian Jewish family. And he started to pick up on their Yiddish, and therefore he spoke Yiddish fluently. And he writes about how that changed his life and his perspective on white people. Now, why? One person, one family, one Russian Jewish family, impoverished family, by the way, showed love to one African-American youngster who then became a world icon, and surely by writing those words, changed the perspective of so many. So yeah, we see one Jewish family impacting one man that eventually changed thousands of people through his words, but it all began because of one Jewish family that impacted their neighbor. I think that therefore, yes, you're right, these organizations are sometimes very blurry and unclear about the message and the mission, especially when we see them engaging in anti-Semitic actions, like destroying synagogues, as we saw in California, in Montreal, and other places around North America. But I think that it would behoove us to look around us, just around us, and try to make a change on one person. If there's an organization in your HOA that does that, and you can get involved with that, great. But sometimes all it takes is initiatives from the self, from our own creativity. And I think we can make a big impact just through those actions that seem small, but essentially are really very, very big. Okay, next question. So I'm going to read from, again, my printer broke down, so I was only able to print two questions, but I have many more here on my laptop right here. Oh, yes, Joyce.
There is Arizona Jews for Justice. It's Arizona Jews for Justice, and I've been in a couple of their things, and they had some very good speakers from different cultures.
Okay,
that were beautiful, and money that's donated, it's very clear where things go and how we can start with very little contributions that could be from ourselves, physically as well as a financial.
Okay, thank you, Joyce. Thanks for that.
Wait, what rabbi runs that? Because I'm just curious.
I'm not sure. I have the information. If you contact me, I can get it.
It's Rabbi Shmuley. It's Rabbi Shmuley.
Oh, Shmuley, yes.
That's
Rabbi Shmuley.
He started that. That's part of VBN, Valley Bacon.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, there are many organizations out there, and again, everyone has their own likings. But if you're unsure, and the question was whether you're unsure of an organization. So if you're unsure, I think we can make the change within our own communities. And yes, there are organizations that some trust, some don't. And feel free to do your own homework. Okay, Two more questions here from the printed paper. Question number one is just to help my, I have two questions that are on my mind. Number one, the first is just to help my understanding of the difference between Levites and Kohanim. I know that to be a Kohen, one is a direct descendant of Aaron, but I would then think that all Levites are also descendants of Moses, correct? Just something that was puzzling me, and I wonder why we don't attribute the honor of being a relative of Moses to Levites. In fact, that is the case. So, yeah, you're right, absolutely right. People that are Kohanim are descendants of Aaron, and people that are Levites are typically descendants of Moses, even though the Moses family was also included Miriam. And the question is whether her children were also considered Levites. That's a big question mark. And maybe that's why there's this hesitance to only speak about Moses. But I'm just going to mute everyone here. You're right. And there is great pride that Levites can have by saying that we descend from Moses. That's a good point and a good clarification. Other question is deeper. And that is, what do our teachings tell us about the consciousness of the soul when we die? Specifically, what happens if one passes away while they are asleep, for example? Does the soul become aware of its leaving the body of the sleeping person to begin its journey? I presume it's the same if someone is awake, but somehow I see it differently when someone who is awake slowly loses their life and transitions to death, as opposed to someone who goes off to sleep, not to awaken in the usual sense. So it's a good question. And of course, I don't think anyone has gone to the next world and come back to tell us exactly how that experience is, whether they were awake or asleep when they left. But I will say a few things. Number one, to go asleep, to die while we're asleep is considered to be a higher level of death. And especially if that death doesn't carry suffering. Some people go to sleep and they don't wake up the next morning. That is what we call in Judaism mitat neshika, which means death of kiss. Maybe that's how that expression evolved in English, of the kiss of death. But whether or not it's connected or not, I don't know. But why is this considered to be death of a kiss, mitat neshika? That's because it's as if God came. What happens when we kiss a person? What's a kiss? A kiss is somehow inhaling breath. Now, what happens is that God came to that person, inhaled his soul back into him, back into God, into the divine sphere of God in the heavens. And he did so just as he did it to Moses and to some of the greats who died in that fashion. So it's considered to be a higher level of death to die in one's sleep. That's just to relate to a death that occurs during the sleep. Now, does the consciousness of the soul follow what is happening to it when it dies during its sleep? Absolutely. Absolutely. The soul is always awake. To use the words of King Solomon, Ani yeshena velibi er. He speaks of the soul. Of course, the Song of Songs speaks of two lovers, but on a deeper level, it speaks really of our relationship with our soul. But he uses the expression of, I am asleep, but my heart is awake, or my soul is awake. Our soul never sleeps. Sleep is really an activity of the body. The soul never sleeps. The soul is always awake. And not only that, no matter how much we try to put the soul to sleep, it will always stay awake. I see that all the time. Jews are trying to ignore their soul, but for some reason, somehow, it pops up. And whether it pops up immediately or it takes years and years to pop, but it happens. There's so many stories about that. That's what we call here in America the Sandy Koufax moment, where, oh, no, I'm Jewish, I can't do that. The soul is awake. The soul is always awake. Now, because the soul is always awake, its consciousness is always awake. And therefore, when it's time for it to leave, it knows, it's conscious, it's completely awake. And it knows that it's leaving from a body that's asleep. But it still knows just as much as it knows when it might be leaving a body that's awake. Its consciousness is always awake. Speaking of the consciousness of the soul, I do want to make this point. I know it's related but unrelated. Make this point that because our soul is always awake, then it's our duty really to pay attention to it. It's not going to leave us alone until we do. And that awakeness of the soul will bother us until the soul feels it's being nurtured. You know, the famous story which I shared a long time ago about the bodyguard of Hitler, a guy named Rocco Smish, who married a Jew, a woman by the name of Greta. When? In 1942, not 10 years before the Holocaust, in the midst of the Holocaust. Imagine this woman, the biggest traitor of a nation. She marries Hitler's bodyguard, who witnessed his suicide, by the way, in that bunker in April of 1945. And she stayed married to him until her death in 1987. How unbelievable is that? What type of a Jewess is that? Now, she had a child, she had a daughter. Just before she died, she called her daughter, her name is Bridget, and she told the daughter, I never told you this, but I want you to know you're Jewish. I'm Jewish, I hid this my whole life, but I want you to know that you're Jewish. The daughter said to herself, now I understand why I never got along with my father. I always felt estranged. After her mother died, she said, well, if I'm Jewish, I better explore my Judaism. She went to live on a kibbutz for 3 months, studied Hebrew. What does she do today? You can look her up. Bridget Engelken, I think her name is. Look her up. What does she do today? She renovates synagogues across the world. She's an architect that renovates synagogues across the world, proving to the whole world the power of the awakeness of the soul. The soul might be put to sleep, but it never really sleeps. By the biggest traitors of our nation. But somehow, somewhere in this generation, next generation, it will awake. And it will find its expression, whether you want it or not. You know, I grew up in France until the age of 8, but I remember living in France, the Cardinal of Paris was a Jew, Jean-Marie Lustiger. And his name was Aaron. His Hebrew name was Aaron. How could he have been the Cardinal of Paris, who, by the way, was in line to becoming the next Pope, as many people said? A Jew becoming the next Pope, imagine this. But how could it be? That's because he, unfortunately, during the war, his parents put him in a church to hide him, and he stayed there. And he had some moments of awakeness. In 1979, he writes in his biography, he thought of leaving it all and going to Israel and living there. He felt so bad. His soul really bothered him. And then he decided, because some pastor convinced him, no, you have to stay, to stay. And he became the Cardinal of Paris. Now, there are 2 scenes I want to bring up. I don't know why I'm going on this rant, but because it's a subject that's so dear to me, maybe. That's what I deal with. You know, and that's what we all ought to deal with. But I remember that in 2005, I think it was, he was asked by the community of Paris to read the list of victims, of the Holocaust victims during Yom HaShoah. He agreed. And he came to the Jewish community and he read the list. And all of a sudden, his eyes, it hit the names of his parents. And he began to cry uncontrollably that he just couldn't continue. Something in him, his soul awoke when he read the name of his pious parents. When he died, the Cardinal of Paris asked the chief rabbi of Paris to come and say the Kaddish. How? How can you explain that? The man was a cardinal. He had abandoned everything that Judaism stands for. But when he died, he asked for the chief rabbi to say Kaddish. Why so? The joke in Paris was that, you know what the difference is between the chief rabbi of Paris and the Cardinal of Paris? The Cardinal of Paris speaks Yiddish and the chief rabbi does not. That was the joke. But here's a man who abandoned his Yiddish, abandoned everything. So how could he ask for Kaddish at his funeral? And the reason is simple, because his soul never slept. Our soul never sleeps. And thus, I have to make a comment of the question like this. We ought to attend to it because it will haunt us and haunt us and haunt us until we finally give it expression. Next question from my laptop right here. Okay. This is a question. Is it wrong to pray in a freelance way? I'm not saying instead of, but in addition to the siddur. Not just may we all have peace while doing it in a drush type of way, while everyone is not really thinking it is a prayer and doesn't seem like a prayer, but to freelance in a serious manner, with our heads bowed or looking downward, concentrating, rather than looking all over the place, but to pray in, for example, some examples of a freelance prayer. Hashem, please help Harriet and Samuel to recover the non-replaceable items that were passed down to them from the Holocaust that were just stolen from them yesterday at gunpoint, and so on. So the gist of the question is it wrong to pray in a freelance way? And the answer is no, not at all. Sometimes those are the prayers that God wants from us. The Talmud states very beautifully, Rahmana libabai. God wants the heart of a person. That's what he wants. And sometimes it's specifically those prayers that really shake the heavens and cancel all the decrees. When a person prays from the heart, he might be driving down the highway and a prayer erupts from him. He might just be in the middle of a court case, say, and some prayer erupts from him because he's shaking. It might be just a prayer like that. Please, I lost, someone came and stole my very treasured items. Please, God, give them back to me. Those are the prayers that God cherishes the most. The Baal Shem Tov was big into that, but the Baal Shem Tov said that, the Baal Shem Tov who founded the Hasidic movement, who brought meaning, life, and joy to Judaism, but the Hasidic movement also created a fundamental shift in the Jewish world. What it did is that it told the world that there is no such thing as a type A Jew and a type B Jew. Until the Baal Shem Tov came about, the scholars, the people who study Torah all day long, were type A Jews. The simpletons were type B Jews. They didn't know anything. They didn't pray like they needed to, or like people thought they needed to. And the Baal Shem Tov came and said, no, I'm sorry. The simple Jews sometimes are on a much higher level than the type, what you think are the type A Jews. And he created that fundamental shift that I hope continues to have an impact until this very day. He created a complete change in the way we view each other. But the Baal Shem Tov once told, and I'm thinking of the story now to answer this question, once told the story of how on Simchat Torah, there was one simple Jew who did not go home after everyone went home, after everyone danced with the Torahs. That simple Jew continued to dance, and he hugged the Torah, and he prayed to God with the Torah with his own words, with a freelance prayer, like this question is referring to. And he prayed to the point that his shoes started losing their leather. So these shoes became all worn out. And this Jew went home, and he thinks, fine, he danced, he did his duty. But he told the story of this Jew to tell his congregation, well, you should know that when I awoke on Simchat Torah morning, my soul went to the heavens, and all of a sudden I see angels creating a beautiful crown made of leather from shoes for God himself. And I asked these angels, where is that leather from? Why are you creating this crown for God? And the angels responded, this leather is from a Jew that's so special up here in heaven. He danced all night long with his own freelance prayers until his shoes were worn out. That Jew deserves to build the crown for God with those prayers, with those actions. And that's the story of the Baal Shem Tov. But sometimes really those freelance prayers are the prayers that create crowns for God. That's what the Baal Shem Tov was saying. So it's certainly not wrong, and it's quite encouraged and supported in Judaism. And the more we can pray freelancely from the heart, the better it is. Rahmana libabai, God wants the heart. Next question. All right, this is a question about a person. I'm gonna try to rephrase it so that it's not obvious, but this is a question about a person asking about what seems to be an abusive, verbally abusive relationship. And thank God, it doesn't seem to have any other types of abuses. But the question is, to get to the question itself, the question is, if a person has been lied to time and time and time again, and trust has been lost in many ways. How can, yet the relationship has made great improvements. How can that trust be rebuilt if the lies continue on? That's the question. It's a hard question. I will offer two answers, and of course I'm happy to speak with this person more and more to get more details and to try and learn the situation at its depth so that I can relate to it better. But I'd offer two very general answers. Number one, I think it depends what type of lies. There's different types of lies. If I lie to my wife and I say to her, you know what, yes, your food was delicious, and it wasn't delicious, then that's fine. I don't think she'll hold that against me. I don't think she should hold that against me. They're small lies, whether it has to do with her or not. Small lies are small lies, and we all know what these small lies are. If I say to my wife, if my wife asks me, did you clean the dishes? And I didn't, but I know it will get her so upset. I'll say, yes, I did. And then I go and do it immediately so that she doesn't know that I just lied. All right, let it be. Fine, it's a small lie. There are lies that break the trust. There are lies that are big lies. Now, if you're speaking about those big lies, then I'll go to answer number two. Answer number two is, how do you in general rebuild trust when lies occur time and time again? Well, it's very hard to rebuild trust when lies occur again and again. But there is one way, and I heard this from Rabbi Steinsaltz himself. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't, but therefore I also need to understand the situation better. But Rabbi Steinsaltz, I remember telling me that the only way a person can rebuild a relationship after lies is if that person does the exact opposite of what those lies entailed. By the way, we learned this in Maimonides a few days ago in our morning or evening service, that if someone has a problem with something, this I'm explaining what Rabbi Steinsaltz was teaching. Let's say the lie is about just to use a very banal example, is about a person's cleanliness. And that could bother people in relationships. That person sweats all the time. Just using this example because it's both half funny and also serious. And the person says, yes, I showered. What can I do? I just showered and I just began to sweat again. But the person did not shower. So then the person, in order to correct these lies and to rebuild that trust, then the person should shower now 7 times a day. Do it to the other extreme. Wherever the lie is coming from, that lie needs to be so corrected that the person goes to the other extreme with the lie, so that it becomes an extreme truth. If that was an extreme lie, then it becomes an extreme truth. When that extreme truth will be demonstrated in a relationship, that's when the trust can start to emerge again. That's when we can rebuild that fundamental trust. That's what I heard from Rabbi Steinsaltz a long time ago. And in a way, I think that I've seen it help many relationships too, that the person who is lying takes upon himself to go to the other extreme. And if he can't do that, then the relationship really will continue to suffer. And it can continue to create a growing crack that will, unfortunately, create a drift in the relationship that can go further apart. But I think it depends really on the person, not just accepting upon himself not to lie, but to changing his way so much that he goes to the other good extreme with them. That's my answer to the question. Again, I'm happy to continue this conversation with the person asking the question. Next question. All right, dear Rabbi, my kids just finished their online schooling, and sadly, the camps were canceled. They are now bored out of their minds at home. Do you have any suggestions? I can empathize with that question even more so than a lot of questions, because that's exactly the situation my kids are in. They are bored out of their minds, as the question right here says. They finished their schooling, and their camps were canceled too. So look, I agree that, and I just want to speak about boredom for a few seconds. I agree that I think that boredom is a terrible curse. Not only that, I think it's the worst curse in the world. There's a historian by the name of Robert Nozick who says that boredom is the reason why many wars occurred in history. Nations were bored, so they said, you know what? Let's excite ourselves and start up with the country next door. Let's start a war. That's his, as an historian, that's his philosophy. There are studies about that. They say that 90%, an overwhelming 90% majority of husbands who cheat on their wives, they still confess to loving their wives. So you ask them, so why did you cheat if you love your wife? Because I was bored. I was looking for some fantasy. Boredom is indeed, but by the way, it's not me saying this. The Ethics of a Father says this, that batala, as it calls it, boredom leads to the worst of sins, leads to the worst of destructions. So I agree that boredom has to be minimized at home as much as possible, even with our own children. So how do you solve this boredom? I think you solve them, but in one of three ways. This is what I'm thinking for my own children too, and feel free to suggest any other suggestions too. Number one, I think every child should pick a skill that he or she needs to develop throughout the summer. If I see that my child has a talent for music, I'll pay the money, even if it might be expensive. But I think it's very important for our children to develop their skills and to do something with the gifts that God gave them. Wasted gift is the worst thing that can happen. So make sure that they spend some time every day to develop that skill. Do everything to support them to develop that skill. Buy them that instrument if it's music. Pay for their lessons. Do whatever it may be. But I think that's one way to conquer this boredom in the most effective fashion. Number two, I think that also children, we spoke about this with the George Floyd topic, but I think also children have to develop, especially now selfie generation, have to develop some type of other-oriented thinking. What do I mean by that? Look for ways they can serve people, serve their surroundings, whether it's the homeless or whether it's engaging them and engaging them in activities in the neighborhood where you help your neighbors, or with other children, or becoming a pen pal with an Israeli child or with a victim of terror. Serve. Spend time to serve. Now, I will add one thing to this because I know you hear it a lot. But if you're going to do that with your child, then you be a part of that serving too. Because when your child sees that, oh, my parents just preached to me, but they don't practice what they preach, it's not going to register. It's just going to create even more confusion and even more turmoil in their own lives. So help your children serve and serve with them. That's number two, beyond their skills. And number three, I think that in our day and age, we're so become such slaves to so many devices, whether it's Xbox or iPads and phones and so on. I think you have the full authority as a parent to impose a non-electronic time at home and say, I'm sorry, from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., no electronics are allowed in the home, and go play, do something, go swim, go jump on the trampoline, go play soccer, do what we used to do as kids, play soccer with Coke cans. Go for it. Do what you need to do to get that activity out. Buy them a bike and let them go biking, maybe go biking with them. Let them play outdoors, let them be physically active. I think that's very important, especially in a device-controlled society as the society that we live in. So these are the three suggestions I have. And
Amen.
And hopefully that will help. That's three. By the way, I didn't include this, but I do think that, of course, spending time with God is also important. Our children ought to spend some time with God, whether it's through prayer or through doing a mitzvah. That's also something I think that's quite important. All right, next question. Dear Rabbi, I've always noticed that some people hide behind their religion, when in fact they are not honest people or not faithful to their families yet. They attend Shabbat and live a religious lifestyle, but they do the opposite. Then you have others that live their life a certain way when they never hurt anyone. They watch their tongue and are always ready to help others, yet aren't as religious as the obvious ones. How does God view this? Well, I want to speak to the term that you use here in your question, the term religion. First, because Judaism is not a religion. You know, if you're not religious, you're still Jewish. But secondly, also because we use the term religion in the most distorted way. I often tell people who tell me, Rabbi, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Or Rabbi, I'm not religious, but I like coming to shul. Rabbi, I'm not religious, but I do this and that. I always tell them, well, 1 second, do you respect your parents? They say yes. Do you conduct your business honestly? They say yes. Are you careful about what you speak? They say yes. I say to them, then you're very religious. All these are mitzvahs. All this is part of our quote unquote religion. So you're very religious. To compartmentalize religion and say only if you keep Shabbat, you're religious. Only if you put on tefillin, you're religious. That goes against everything Judaism believes in. Religion in Judaism is doing Shabbat as much as you guard your tongue. It's doing tefillin as much as you respect your parents. It's doing candle lighting every Shabbat, every Friday afternoon, as much as you are faithful and you're an honest person. That's what religion is, so much more encompassing than those fragments that we speak about when we converse about religion in general here in this country. That's number two. And number three, I will say one more thing, and that is that religion does not immune us to anything. It doesn't. Unfortunately, I've also met people who claim to be ultra religious, and they are, like you say, they are the most dishonest. But why? Because religion doesn't immune you to anything. Does that mean that you have to stop doing what you're doing? If you have to stop keeping Shabbat if you're a dishonest person? No. Well, no, because one mitzvah is one mitzvah and another mitzvah is another mitzvah. We live with contradictions all the time. But one thing for sure is that that side of religion, keeping Shabbat and putting on tefillin, won't immune you and won't make it easier for you to be honest. You still have to work on being honest and on respecting your parents and all those mitzvahs that are deemed non-religious mitzvahs, although they are very religious, as we mentioned. So religion doesn't immune you to anything. And if you are engaged in religious activities, don't start tapping yourself on the shoulder and saying to yourself, oh, I'm religious now, I don't have to work on my honesty. No, it won't immune you to that. And if you have that weakness, then you have to work on that weakness as you have to work on all other weaknesses. So that's what I will say to that question. Beautiful. I ended now the questions that I received today, but I do see that there are some questions, I think, on this chat.
I have a question, Rabbi Allouche.
Yes.
So,
Randy,
just when you're talking about someone saying they're not very religious, or they are religious, how you just described it, can you interchange the word religious for observant? Like if someone says, I'm an observant Jew, or do those have the same connotation in what you described a few minutes ago, or no?
I stay away from any of those labels. And I'll tell you why, because again, people who respect their parents and don't keep Shabbat still observe that mitzvah of respecting your parents. So what label? I know the human language and has to use some type of label. I would say, I would specify the mitzvahs then. Oh, you keep Shabbat? Good, beautiful. You observe Shabbat? Great. You don't respect your parents? Bad. I would specify the mitzvah, but to give generalizations, especially with terms like observance and religion is very, very hard. You know, I'm reminded of the story of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Allouche, whose son now is the chief rabbi. But Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau once came to the Rebbe and he was very proud. And he said to the Rebbe, you know, I want you to know I'm opening an organization for Kiruv Rechokim. You may have heard the word Kiruv. It's another word I despise. And it's used very often to relate to outreach activities, that people reach out to Jews and bring them closer to the fold, as they say. So they call that activity Kiruv. And it's overused, but it's such a disgusting word, and I'll explain why because of the story. By the way, also, we don't believe in outreach. There's no such thing as a Jew being out there and me being in here. We believe in inreach, not in outreach. But anyway, Chief Rabbi Allouche comes and says, I opened an organization for kiruv rechokim, bringing the distant ones closer. And I just want to mention this to the Rebbe. The Rebbe says, what? Again, Chief Rabbi Allouche says, I open an organization for kiruv rechokim. You should be proud for bringing the distant ones closer. The Rebbe again says, what? He says, well, I open an organization for kiruv rechokim, for bringing the distant ones close. And the Rebbe says, 1 second, and how do you know who's close and who's distant in the eyes of God? How can you say you're bringing the distant ones closer? But that person that you think is distant, you think that in the eyes of God he's distant? Maybe not. Maybe he's closer closer to God than you are. So how can you say kiruv rechokim? And I'm saying the same thing about people who don't seem observant. Now, don't get me wrong. I do believe that we each have to grow. There's no such thing as staying in the same as it is in life. You're either growing or you're decreasing. You're either climbing or you're falling down. It's like an arrow. It's either going up or going down. There's no two way about it. There's no two way about it in general. So I do think that every single Jew should be growing in their own Jewish journey. And that's what we're all about here at CBT, encouraging people to grow in their own way, in their own spiritual journey with yet another mitzvah. But to say that I'm close and he's far, you think that you're doing all these mitzvahs such as Shabbat and Tefillin and so on, and the other is not? Not true. Not true. God has different ways of measuring people. And we certainly can't play God when it comes to measuring them and their distance from God. So that's that story.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes, Hannah.
Okay, so unfortunately, my friend Galit, she was here last year, in fact, when her son had a bar mitzvah. So her father passed away, and they did a Zoom funeral. And then they're pretty observant, so they, I use the word observant, they were doing this Zoom Shiva. And are there any protocols, or what do we do? I wasn't sure, I did go, and, you know, is there something that we need to know about doing Zoom Shivas?
Look, the biggest thing we can do for mourners that are sitting Shiva is to be there for them, whether with words or without words. Sometimes words just diminish the impact. Depends on the person, depends on your relationship with that person. But I think just being on the Zoom is in and of itself a big mitzvah. What's the protocol? I mean, the only protocol I can think of is that traditional blessing of saying to the mourner, Hamakom yinachem etchem betoch sha'ar Avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May God comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Why is that the protocol, by the way, according to Judaism? I found it beautiful. Why are we saying, may God comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem? What does Zion and Jerusalem have to do with this? But there are many answers to this. But one of the answers by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shneimson of blessed memory, is that we believe that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. That the Mashiach will come and the third temple will come down from the heavens, as the Midrash says, or be rebuilt by us all. So what we're saying to the mourner when we're saying, may you be comforted among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, what are the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem doing? They're praying for the reconstruction of Jerusalem. And they believe in it. And so too must you, mourner, believe in the resurrection of the dead and in that rebuilding of your life. And that's why we mix the mourning's blessings with the subject of Jerusalem and Zion. So that's the protocol usually. But otherwise, you know, you have to know the person that you're offering your comfort to and see whether silence is the name of the game or maybe words that are appropriate.
Yeah, it was very interesting because I know the family very, very well. I used to do like Rosh Hashanah with them. So what happened is I went on the Zoom and then Galit said, oh, Hannah is on. Do you have anything to say? So it was very, very nice, but I wasn't sure. But right. That's a good idea. Thank you.
A good question. Yeah, but I'll say this and I'll add one more thing. I heard this from Rabbi Steinsaltz many times. He said to me, do you know what the most important part of a bar mitzvah is? The day after. Do you know what the most important part of a wedding is? The day after. Do you know what the most important part of visiting someone during Shiva is? Visiting him the day after. The 8th day. That's the most important part. Because when mourners sit Shiva, thank God they have many people come to them and we should go to them too. But afterwards, what happens to them? the day after becomes the most important part.